From the air, a healthy coral reef looks like a dark stain on the ocean, dense, textured, almost bruised against the pale blue of shallow water. The colors are wrong for what you expect from the sea. Deep browns, olive greens, occasional bursts of violet where soft corals cluster. The shapes are fractal, branching, folding, repeating at every scale. A healthy reef from 300 meters looks like a living geology, a landscape that breathes. From the air, a dead one looks like a cloud fell into the sea, white, featureless, still. In March 2016, Terry Hughes chartered a small aircraft and flew the length of the Great Barrier Reef. The survey covered over 1,100 kilometers. Hughes was a coral ecologist at James Cook University in Townsville, and he had spent 30 years studying reef systems. He knew what healthy coral looked like from altitude. He had done aerial surveys before, dozens of them, across multiple bleaching cycles. But nothing in 3 decades of fieldwork had prepared him for what he saw that month. Below the aircraft, for hundreds of kilometers, the reef was white. Not pale, not patchy, white. The color of bone. The color of a living system with the life removed from it. The mechanism is not complicated. Corals are animals, tiny polyps that build calcium carbonate skeletons and live in colonies numbering in the billions. But they cannot feed themselves efficiently. They depend on symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae, single-celled organisms that live inside coral tissue and produce up to 90% of the coral's energy through photosynthesis. The algae also give coral its color, the greens, browns, oranges, and pinks that make a healthy reef look like an underwater garden. The relationship is ancient. It has existed for over 200 million years. When water temperature rises by as little as 1 degree Celsius above the normal summer maximum and stays there for several weeks, the chemistry of the partnership breaks. The algae begin producing toxic oxygen radicals instead of sugar. The coral has no choice. It expels the algae, millions of cells, pushed out through its own tissue. What remains is the transparent polyp sitting on a white calcium skeleton, bleached. If the temperature drops within a few weeks, the algae can recolonize. The coral recovers. If it does not drop, the coral starves to death on its own skeleton, surrounded by water it can no longer extract energy from. The 2016 event was not the first mass bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef. The first recorded event hit in 1998, driven by a severe El Niño that pushed sea surface temperatures across the tropical Pacific above seasonal norms. Surveys showed damage across roughly 40% of reefs, concentrated in the shallows. A second event struck in 2002, smaller in extent but still significant. Both events generated scientific papers, government reviews, and public concern. Both were followed by something that, in retrospect, may have been the most dangerous outcome of all: recovery. The reef bounced back. Coral cover on monitored sites returned to pre-bleaching levels within 8 to 10 years. The narrative solidified. Bleaching was serious but temporary. The reef was resilient. The system could take a hit and heal. The recovery created a template that the tourism industry and the government adopted as doctrine. Yes, bleaching happens. Yes, it is concerning. But the reef recovers. This is what coral reefs do. The message was not false. It was incomplete. Recovery depends on intervals. The reef healed after 1998 because it had a decade of stable conditions before the next event. The reef healed after 2002 for the same reason. What nobody modeled, or nobody wanted to model, was what would happen when the intervals disappeared. Hughes published his findings in Nature in March 2017. The paper was co-authored by dozens of researchers across multiple institutions, drawing on aerial surveys, underwater transects, and satellite data. The conclusions were stark. 29% of the reef's shallow water corals had died in a single calendar year. In the northern third of the reef, the most remote section, 1,000 kilometers from the nearest city, the mortality rate exceeded 67%. This section had been considered the reef's stronghold. It was the farthest from agricultural runoff, from port dredging, from coastal development, from every local stressor that reef managers could theoretically control. The damage there eliminated the usual explanations. The cause was not pollution, not overfishing, not anchor damage from tourist boats. The cause was heat, Ocean surface temperature in the northern Coral Sea had exceeded the bleaching threshold for 8 consecutive weeks during the austral summer. The reef had cooked, and the section that should have been safest had died fastest because it was positioned in the warmest water. The Australian government's response was not to address the findings, it was to manage them. In 2016, the Department of the Environment successfully lobbied UNESCO to remove all references to the Great Barrier Reef and to Australian World Heritage sites generally from a report on the impact of climate change on World Heritage properties. The request was made before the report was published. The stated reason was that including the reef would damage Australia's tourism brand. The Guardian later obtained documents showing that the language had been specific. Australian officials told UNESCO that negative references could cause ___0___ among tourists considering visiting the country. The report was edited. The references were removed. The reef disappeared from the most significant international assessment of climate damage to protected sites. The unstated reason was arithmetic. Reef-related tourism generates approximately $6.4 billion per year. It supports over 60,000 jobs across Queensland. It funds boat operators, resort owners, dive instructors, helicopter tour companies, and the coastal towns that depend on visitors who come to see the reef as it appears in photographs, vivid, intact, alive. The reef is not just an ecosystem, it is a brand. And brands do not benefit from headlines about mass death. The pattern of managing perception over reality extended into every corner of the reef's public image. Coral gardening, the practice of growing coral fragments in underwater nurseries and transplanting them onto damaged reef sections, became the dominant narrative of recovery. The Australian government announced a reef restoration and adaptation program. Philanthropic foundations contributed millions. The projects were photogenic. They produced images that worked on magazine covers and in tourism brochures. Divers planting coral, close-ups of bright new growth, time-lapses of nurseries expanding. The coverage was enormous. The scale was not. The total area covered by all coral restoration projects on the Great Barrier Reef combined amounted to less than 2% of the reef's surface. The reef spans 344,000 square kilometers, roughly the area of Japan. The nurseries were gardens in a continent. A single bleaching event in 2016 killed more coral in 3 months than every restoration project in history had planted. The arithmetic was public. It appeared in peer-reviewed papers. It appeared in Hughes's own presentations. The response from the restoration community was that every fragment mattered. The response from the physics was that the ocean did not negotiate. Hughes was blunt about the gap. In interviews, in papers, in conference presentations, he repeatedly drew attention to the disproportion between the scale of the problem and the scale of the response. Coral restoration, he argued, was a distraction, not because the science was wrong, but because it allowed governments and industries to substitute visible action for effective action. The reef needed global emissions reductions. It was getting funded optimism. This made him uncomfortable company. Tourism operators accused him of talking down the reef. State politicians suggested his research was damaging the economy. Some colleagues in the restoration field felt that his public skepticism undermined their funding. Hughes kept publishing. The data kept getting worse. After one aerial survey in 2016, he posted on social media that he had shown the result to his students and then put his head on his desk and wept. The post went viral. It was unusual. Scientists do not typically announce grief in public. But it captured something that press releases and journal abstracts could not. The emotional weight of watching a system you had studied for 3 decades die faster than your models had predicted. Then, the reef bleached again. In March 2017, less than 12 months after the first event, a second mass bleaching struck the central third of the reef. The sections that had been spared in 2016 were hit in 2017. The cumulative footprint of the 2 events covered 2/3 of the entire system. The recovery window had collapsed. Corals that survived the first bleaching had not had time to rebuild their zooxanthellae populations before the second wave of heat arrived. Juvenile corals, the larvae that settle on dead skeletons and begin the slow process of rebuilding, had not even reached reproductive maturity. The reef was being hit faster than it could reproduce. Hughes described the back-to-back events as unprecedented in the observational record. The probability models used by reef scientists had not predicted consecutive mass bleachings for another decade. The models assumed recovery intervals that the climate had already eliminated. The ocean was ahead of schedule. The pattern holds the weight of the story. When the same process that ravaged a medical system for a decade, mistaking management for cure, maps exactly onto an ecosystem, the lesson is not ecological. It is structural. The profitable answer and the correct answer pointed in different directions. The system chose the profitable one. Not through conspiracy, not through ignorance, through incentive. The tourism operators who market the reef are not lying. The coral they show visitors is real. The nurseries they fund are growing real fragments. The photographs are genuine. The deception is not in the content, it is in the framing. A tourist who snorkels over a coral nursery in the Whitsundays sees a thriving patch of reef. What they do not see is the 344,000 square kilometers around it. What they do not see is the aerial view, the one Hughes saw from his aircraft, where the white patches stretch to the horizon and the scale of the loss becomes legible only from altitude. The reef bleached again in 2020, the third mass event in 5 years, and again in 2022. The 2022 event was particularly alarming because it occurred during a La Niña year, a climate phase that typically brings cooler ocean temperatures to the Coral Sea. In previous decades, La Niña had functioned as a natural break on coral stress, a period when reefs could recover. The bleaching threshold was exceeded anyway. The baseline ocean temperature had shifted upward far enough that even the cool phase of the cycle was now warm enough to trigger bleaching. What used to be an anomaly, a 1 in 20-year thermal event, had become a 1 in 2-year certainty. The intervals between mass bleaching events had compressed from roughly a decade in the 1990s to roughly 24 months. The recovery math no longer worked. Corals need roughly 10 years of stable conditions to regrow after severe bleaching. They were getting 2. Hughes retired from his position at James Cook University in 2023. The man who had spent more hours surveying coral bleaching from the air than perhaps any scientist alive stepped back from the field he had dedicated his career to. He did not retire quietly. In one of his final public statements, he noted that the reef's official status, downgraded to __1_outlook by the Australian government's own marine authority in 2019, had not changed the policy response in any measurable way. The tourism campaigns continued. The coral nurseries expanded their Instagram presence. The emissions trajectory remained the same. The gap between what the data showed and what the brochures promised was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was a matter of industry. The Great Barrier Reef is still there. Parts of it are recovering. Fast-growing species, Acropora, the branching corals that colonize rubble quickly, are reappearing on some damaged sites. Fish populations in certain sections have stabilized. The system is alive. But the composition is shifting. Heat-sensitive species are declining. Heat-tolerant species are expanding. The reef of 2026 is not the reef of 2015, and the reef of 2035 will not be the reef of 2026. The structure is simplifying. Biodiversity is narrowing. The version that existed before the 2016 bleaching, the one in the tourism brochures, the one in the documentary footage, the one that drew 2 million visitors a year to Cannes and the Whitsundays, is a historical artifact. It is being replaced by something tougher, simpler, and less diverse. The question that remains is not whether the reef will survive. Coral has survived 5 mass extinctions over 400 million years. The question is what it will become, and whether the organism that replaces what was lost will resemble what $6.4 billion a year was spent to believe in. Next time, a technology so important that 2 scientists went to court over who owned it. One got the Nobel, the other got the patent. The prize and the profit went to different people.